Well, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Sam Shay. Dr. Sam is a chiropractic doctor, functional medicine practitioner, stand-up comedian, and expert in the world of genetics. And, we've talked from time to time with various people about the role of what we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are these little shifts in our genes that can kind of dictate how our cells function. So, Sam, I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me. I always love chatting with you. I feel like I can go full nerd and be met. And so I see you. And yeah, I guess it's a kind of open playing field. Like, how would you like to start? Genetics is a huge field. Is there a particular subject you're wanting to really dig into?
Well, I think, people who are part of our membership are struggling with some element of chronic illness. I think it'd be really helpful for people to understand, why looking at your genetics might be important, and are there specific genetic clusters or specific genes that you sort of target when you're thinking about chronic illness?
Sure. So there's many, just to clarify, on different types of genetics testing out there, and I have one specific lane, but
Yeah.
there's several different lanes, and it's important to understand the differences. So one lane is paternity testing. That's like CSI Miami stuff. Well, that's not what we're doing here. Okay. The next lane is, genealogy. Like, what percentage Irish are you? And that's not what I do. I mean, sure, it's great and important for even for health reasons, because certain lineages have certain different risk profiles as it relates to other inherited disease patterns, but that's not what we're focusing on. The next one is karyotyping, which has to do with pregnancy, and it's a very specific type of genetics testing if you're really going full into IVF and fertility and all the rest of it. That's not what we're doing. The next one is like super niche, like disease-based, like there's like a 1 in 1,000, 1 in 3,000, 1 in 10,000, 0.00001% thing. That is like a PhD level niche expertise on this one thing. That's not what we're doing. And what we're looking at are the genes, the most important genes as it relates to health and well-being, and the overall most important genes as it relates to any chronic disease pattern. And the reason I can say that is that we're not looking in this particular genes that we've been talking about. I'm not chasing after disease genes. In fact, there's modern Western genetics when it comes to health is very much in the same philosophy as germ theory. So germ theory is like one germ causes one disease. And in Western genetics, it's like one gene causes one disease.
Right.
And as you know, this bickering between Pasteur and Beauchamp over is it the germ or is it the terrain? Is it the milieu? And the same thing in Western genetics versus functional genetics. We're talking about is it the gene? Or is it a cluster of genes that are influenced by the wrong inputs by the environment, whether it's external environments or high stress, and you're changing the expression, therefore pushing downstream on the quote disease gene. But if you go back upstream to the cluster of influential genes above it that are influenced by lifestyle, diet, nutrition, etc., then you're basically looking at the genetic terrain. It's the equivalent of the genetic terrain as opposed to focusing on the specific quote disease gene. So what I'm not doing is I'm not going to talk about the stroke gene, the heart attack gene, the cancer gene, the Alzheimer's gene, the diabetes gene, or whatever other disease du jour you're thinking of. So instead, we're going to go upstream to the genetic milieu and look at the cluster of the most important genes, that the terrain. And the way to understand it is, what are the drivers of all diseases? And there are 7 key drivers, and I'll actually share a visual for people that are watching. Like, how do you know what genes to look at? Which is an excellent question. Thank you for asking, Darin. That was a great question. How do you know? So there are 7 drivers of all diseases. Number 1 is inflammation. Surprise. Number 2 is cell defense, which is divided into scavenging free radicals in the mitochondria. There's 3 key genes that are the janitors inside the mitochondria, where 95% of all the free radicals are made. And then there's the liver detox genes for cell defense. So you've got phase 1, phase 2, and there's 8 major genes between phase 1 and phase 2 that deal with that. There's 15 major genes that involve with inflammation. Then you've got the vitamin D receptors as the next segment of these drivers. Now, the vitamin D receptors, these are not the genes to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight. This is getting vitamin D into the blood is half the journey. You can get it through sunlight, through supplements, and through food. But getting vitamin D from blood into the cells is the important half of the journey. And that's where the vitamin D receptors come in. And these receptors are literal docking sites where vitamin D is floating in the blood, and then it lands on the docking site, then it goes into the cell. And just so people understand, vitamin D is so important. It controls estimated between 3 to 5% of the entire genome.
Wow.
That's 1/33 to 1/20th of the whole gig. And for a lot of people don't know that, most people assume, oh, vitamin D, that's for like bone density, right? It's like, a little bit, yeah. But really the main function is to control inflammation and regulate immunity. Those are the main functions of vitamin D. And if you can't get vitamin D into your cells, you have a problem. In fact, this is such a critical issue that when I ran my genetics testing, and I have been, I'll just skip down to the vitamin D segment right here. When I was very sickly as a child. I had severe insomnia, really bad digestive problems, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, terrible diet, very bad environment, a lot of violence in school and gaslighting at home. And I was just exhausted and ill and sickly and didn't have a growth spurt. And it was not good. And so when I got my genetics back, I saw just how genetically vulnerable I was to overinflammation, and including I had a double red in my vitamin D receptors. And I was thinking like, great, I'll just take, some vitamin. Before it was like vitamin D and get sunlight, but I wasn't actually using vitamin D properly. And what happened, what I realized when I had done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these tests, I found with only one exception, everyone who had a chronic illness that I worked with that did genetics had variants in their vitamin D receptors. The person with the one exception had horrific stress. I mean, like losing or nearly losing a child type stress that would drive anyone into a chronic situation. And so what I did is I went back to the chief science officer, Dr. Beaver, who put this all together. And I said, I want you to check the database, and I want you to talk with your other top docs who are running hundreds of these tests. And I want you to check the following. Is there a correlation between double variants in VDR1 and VDR2, usually red, but I've seen yellow as also, and chronic disease? And he came back to me a couple of months later and he said, there's absolutely a correlation, because he checked the database and he checked in with the other practitioners, and they all said there's absolutely a correlation. So now here's the thing. It's like, is it you just take more vitamin D? He's like, no, what we're looking at is, well, I mean, it wouldn't hurt necessarily. I mean, there's some, you can't get hypervitaminosis D, but that'd be pretty heroic to get to that level of dosing. But what we're looking at here is not just giving more vitamin D, it's actually changing the genetic expression. This is epigenetics, changing the epigenetic expression of the VDR genes to express more docking sites. How can we make more? Because if you have a yellow or a red variant, you don't make enough of the docking sites. So you can have all the vitamin D floating around, but it's not actually, enough is not docking to create an effect. So there's precious few things that upregulate the vitamin D receptors. One is avoiding smoking in all forms, primary, secondary, and tertiary smoke. We want to avoid pollution. And there's taking sulforaphane, which is a broccoli sprout extract, and that upregulates VDRs. So that's a bit granular as we're trying to talk about overview, but that's just an example of if you know your genes, then you can know exactly what you can do in terms of lifestyle, diet, nutrition to actually upregulate the genes in order to make the red dot VDR genes will never be green. Never. Right. but you can make the red dots behave green-like.
Yeah.
You can make them behave that way with consistent discipline and proper lifestyle consistently over time. And that's the positive message of doing this type of testing, where you can know exactly what lifestyle changes to make. For me, I was having joint pain like an 80-year-old man in my 30s. And then I got my genes and I was like, whoa, I am massively over pro-inflammatory. And then I did the things and now I don't have joint pain anymore. I also was able to change my diet, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So the so we talk about inflammation, free radical damage, scavenging the mitochondria, liver detox, vitamin D receptors. Then the fifth is methylation and homocysteine metabolism, which is important note. These are all hierarchical. So inflammation is at the top and controls the ones underneath it. So methylation is actually subordinate to inflammation. And then we have cardiovascular health and circulation. And then we've got fat and cholesterol and energy metabolism as the seventh. So we have these 7 categories. So we have of the tens of thousands of genes out there, we've narrowed it down to which of them are in these 7 categories. Then we narrow down which of these genes that are in these 7 categories are the generals or the upstream controllers of all the downstream genes. So there's hundreds of genes related to inflammation directly or indirectly. We're looking at the top 15 that control the hundreds underneath. And then we're looking at, of the remaining genes, which of them have at least 10% variation in the general public. This is not the 0.00001% genetic variation we're looking at. We're looking at, if we're going to do a gene test, I want to test the most important ones that are most likely to have variations. And then the fourth criteria is that each gene has to have peer-reviewed research done on humans, not nematodes or worms or fruit flies or plants or whatever, and that lifestyle, diet, exercise, nutrition alone can make the epigenetic changes. So after all of that, there's only like 100-ish genes that fill those 4 criteria. That's it. Only 4 that fit in those 7 categories, that are upstream, that have at least 10% variation in the general public, and then have the peer-reviewed research done on humans in good journals. There's only like 100. So that's good news, because you're not going to be drowning in hundreds and hundreds of genes and getting overwhelmed with generic health tips that aren't organized or prioritized, which is also really important to know about the recommendations that you get, that they are prioritized. And you know how to prioritize them because the inflammation ones are highest up on the list, and then it goes down from there. Because I would rather give someone a list of 30 things that they can do in order of priority than say, here's the 300 things you do from this other genetics test, and there's no prioritization. And sure, there's no way you're not going to feel overwhelmed, confused, intimidated, and careen into nihilistic fatalism. You might as well just give up now because there's just too many things to do. So it's more data is not better. Better organized and prioritized data is better. That's what this type of gene test is. And that's how I can know that if I'm looking at helping someone with their health, their well-being, or whatever is going on chronically, that if I use this framework, then I am working on the highest priority genes that are the most likely to help globally with whatever is going.
Well, that's what I've appreciated about your work, because again, I've heard a lot of people lecture about genes and SNPs, and like you said, it's kind of, word salad. You get these long multi-page reports of a bunch of genes, which are probably not clinically significant, or we don't have any data on how that gene can be influenced. So then it just becomes kind of fluff. So to be able to look at your genetic profile and know what's actionable, I think that's really important. So, maybe we can dive into some of these more specific, gene types. What are variants that we can actually do something about? Like
Sure.
you said, your genes are your genes. That's never going to change. But how do we bypass some of these hiccups?
Sure. So here's literally the list of the 15 most important inflammatory genes. I think recently they added a 16th, which it's an extra COX. I think it's COX-2-2 gene that was added. But these are the 15. And for people who are new to this, don't get lost in the hexadecimal hieroglyphic, run-on sentences, these things over here. Just look at the circles, look at the clustering. So I divided up these inflammatory genes into 3 parts: the genes that initiate inflammation, the genes that propagate or sustain it, and the genes that extinguish it. So, and in this is a real case, and this woman had gone to without telling me, she went to go join a CrossFit gym and got a trainer that was exercising her like an hour a day for 5 days out of the 7. And what happened is she just started to gain weight and her cycles went off. Okay. And so what happened was that she came back to me, is like, I don't understand. I'm getting fatter. I'm losing muscle tone and my cycles are all wonky. What happened? And so we ran her gene profile, and it turns out she's an overinflamer, because all 3 stages, and what's particularly interesting here, this cluster, the CRP1, 2, 3 genes, that those code for the acute phase inflammatory protein in the liver. So when she's inflamed, her liver gets especially clogged. And that's significant because when it comes to her trying to clear estrogen. So what happened was that when she over-exercised, which the CrossFit community is notorious for this,
Right.
she became pro-inflammatory. So what happens when you're pro-inflammatory from over-exercise, or any other thing you can do to inflame yourself, like eating crappy food or missing too much sleep or stressing out or whatever it might be, exposed to specific toxins, getting an infection, whatever it might be. One, she put on weight, not calorie weight, she put on water weight. And when the body is inflamed, these inflammatory chemicals are very dangerous. They're damaging to cells and tissues. So what happens is the body will retain water in the interstitia. Interstitia means it's the spaces between the cells. It will retain water to do what? Dilute the damaging, toxic, inflammatory chemicals from bumping up against the cells and hurting them. To do what? You buy time. By diluting all the inflammatory chemicals, you buy time to give your liver and kidneys time to filter all the inflammatory chemicals out. So your body is putting on water weight. It's retaining inflammatory water weight if you get overinflamed. So that's why she was putting on weight, but it was a weird type of weight because her muscle tone was washing out. It was like the skin just kind of rose with water and she lost the muscle tone. And it was just this puffy weight. I mean, the people I think know what I mean when I say puffy weight. And then what happened is her cycles went off. And then I looked at her, the 8 most important liver genes. And again, you can zoom in and like look at all the nitty gritty details and all the jargon and the hexadecimal designations of the different genes. But instead, just look at the red circles here that say estrogen, 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 inflammation. And so what happened is that she already had an innate problem metabolizing and detoxing estrogen out of her system. So what happened was that when she got overinflamed from overexercised, and she had this particular combo of the 3 CRP genes also having variants, her liver got overinflamed. She also had trouble clearing it. So now her liver is on fire. And pretend your liver is your kitchen. And if you had a choice between throwing out the garbage, meaning throwing out the used estrogen, or putting out a giant grease fire in your kitchen, what's the priority? You put out the fire. So the liver is looking at estrogen floating in. I was like, we're going to let you overflow because we have other priorities at the moment. So she had this massive rush of estrogen that was just filling, that she couldn't detox. So her cycles just went bonkers. And now in men, and now I had 2 case studies of men with a very, very, very similar profile with the 3 CRP genes and estrogen detox problems, especially GSTP1, because that's the rate limiting step. That's the gene for the rate limiting step for glutathione synthesis. They didn't obviously have cycles that went off, but they got the same inflammatory water weight gain. But what happened instead, they didn't get their cycles thrown off because they didn't have any cycles to begin with, but they both develop a gynecomastia, which is a polite way of saying man boobs.
Right.
So if you now have excess inflammation creating excess excess weight, and then you have excess estrogen, that excess estrogen is going to reposition where that weight is distributed to the chest on men. So with them, like with her, I first off, I looked at all of their lifestyles and checked for, are you getting any exogenous input of estrogen? Now, for her, not so much. For the men, they all had, heated plastics. They were, pesticide-laced vegetables. There's about 8 major causes of exogenous estrogen. But they had one had like 6, the other had like 4 or 5. I can't remember. So put them on an anti-estrogen, anti-inflammatory, liver cleansing diet, lifestyle, and nutrients and specific nutrients to these genes to help them detox better and deflame better. One guy lost 40 pounds in 1 month.
Wow.
The other guy lost 4 pounds a week for 11 or 13 weeks. Sorry, 1 kg. This was over in New Zealand. So he lost 1 kg a week which is 2 pounds. I was thinking in pounds. Yeah. 1 kg a week for, I was at 11 or 13, some prime number, 11 or 13. I can't remember. And they lost it around their chest, and they lost it around their belly, and their pain levels went away, and they were super happy about that. And her muscle tone returned, her cycles normalized, and I had some choice words for that CrossFit trainer.
And that was all water weight.
That was water. Now, no, there's one. No, it's mostly water weight. So there's a thing with interleukin 6, where I don't have the graphic here, but actually I can probably pull it up real quick. Yeah, I can actually pull it up because, hey, we're nerding out, right? Why not just lean in? All right, we're gonna lean in for you, Darin. Anything, blah, blah, blah.
Well, I see this a lot in my own patients where, they
There,
are
you go.
resistant to exercise. They're following their diet, they're eating clean, they're working out, and they just can't drop the weight. So yeah, I kind of wonder how much of this is sort of this genetic disposition that's undermining that whole process.
Sure. There's actually, and we'll come back to that. I've actually identified 3 separate genetic weight types. There's 3 types of genetic weight gainers, and people who struggle in 3 separate ways genetically for their weight. So the inflammatory water weight is the most common, and there's so here is the inflammatory pathway in a schema, and this is going to get a bit nerdy. So we've got the interleukin 1s over here in the corner, interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. Now, people who have looked at anything into inflammation, they learn very quickly the term interleukin 6 and TNF alpha, because they're keystones, and you can see it in the schematic because they're like at the center of the storm, both of them. So there's most of the weight is water weight, with one exception, that what happens is that increased interleukin 6 can mess with the fat cells and actually create changes to the fat cells. So you can create more, not water weight, but like fat cell weight.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one little tributary off this inflammatory pathway that can create more fat cell based weight. So that's what I wanted to point out. So in regards to the other weight classes, is we're talking genetics or boxing? I've lost track here. So there are, literally is the next slide. Look at that. All right. So there's 3 types. There's inflammatory water weight, there's hormonal toxic weight, and then there's caloric fat weight. Now, in the examples we just described was a combination of inflammatory water weight and hormonal toxic weight. The other type of weight is the caloric fat weight, where you have trouble with the fat and energy metabolism, where you either have problems over storing fat and have problems releasing it out to be burned, or you have problems with burning fat in the mitochondria for energy and heat. So this is like the ADR3 beta. This is the uncoupling genes. This is LEPR1, LEPR2 genes for burning fat. Like there's a cluster of about 5 genes for burning fat for energy in the mitochondria, and 2 to 3, depending on if you get 3 UCP genes or 2, that are tested. How well can you burn mitochondria burn fat in the mitochondria for heat, like brown fat, like a bear? So if you have and there's also genes for satiation. Like, do you have the genes that make you feel less satiated from eating normal amounts of food? If you have those genes that have variations, then you overeat because fullness is not in the stomach, it's in the brain. The signal comes from the brain, sorry, comes from the stomach to the brain. And if you've got these genes, there's delays in that signaling. So you
Right.
can eat more before you realize that you're full.
Mhm.
So now, in all of these cases, all three that I just mentioned, their caloric fat weight genes were fine. They were not even consequential. So their weight was inflammatory and hormonal toxic. And so when you look at your specific gene types, you can actually target what you do to deal with any stubborn weight that's not going away. Almost always it's inflammatory is the priority. And I would also put into this category histamine intolerance genes.
Yeah.
So histamine intolerance genes is also something that's tested. And here's the thing, here's how I describe histamine. We may have talked about this on the last time we talked, I can't remember, but to me, here's how I explain histamine. Histamine does a lot of stuff, but I'm just going to think its biggest evolutionary reason for its existence is that histamine is the body's evolutionary defense against venom. It's the evolutionary defense against venom. Because if you are stung as a hunter-gatherer by a spider, a bee, a wasp, a scorpion, a centipede, certain plants have, whatever it is, you take a bee, it stings your arm and your arm instantly swells up. The bee did not inject a cup or two of water into your arm. It injected venom. And the body said, oh, look, something extremely dangerous that's going to corrode or erode muscle, bone, tissue, nerve, artery, vein. We're going to pull this flood switch called histamine, and we're going to drown that thing in water. Very similarly to the body retaining water in the interstitia to dilute inflammation. I think it's just the more acute, extreme button in the body to push when you get venom injected. I mean, certain snake venom is so dangerous it can melt bone. It's very rare, but it's very rare snakes can do that. But they're strong enough it can melt bone. I remember listening to NPR where Scott Simon interviewed, this is like in the 90s, he interviewed a guy who is a snake venom collector, and he's been bitten so many times in his life, the hospital literally uses his blood as anti-venom.
Oh.
That was his claim to fame. His blood is literal walking anti-venom. And he described this one snake that bit him on the finger that actually started to melt not only the flesh off, but the bone off of his finger. That's that's that image I remember. You're welcome for having that in your head now. So but to make the point, venom is so dangerous that it could melt bone. Of course, you want to have an emergency flood switch to dilute it as quickly as possible, and that is histamine. So if you have, if you're stung by a bee, your body floods the area with water and you swell up. Okay, now if you eat foods that are either that if you have the genetic vulnerability to not being able to clear histamine, and then you eat foods that either are high in histamine or they're foods that increase the internal release of histamine, or you eat foods that shut down the enzyme that breaks down histamine, you are effectively eating a slow-moving full-body bee sting that is now swelling your whole body. So that is the best understanding I can come to using first principle evolutionary biology to explain how histamine creates water weight. Now, I have seen this over and over and over and over in clinical practice, as I'm sure you have. You put people on an antihistamine diet, and they will kick and scream and argue and negotiate harder on an antihistamine diet than literally any diet I have ever tried to put anyone on in my life. Have you had this experience? You tell a Californian they can't have avocado, they will lose their mind.
Sadly, that's true.
So an antihistamine diet is tough because there's a lot of quote healthy foods like lemons and limes and avocado and a bunch of other things, tea and cacao, and that are also high in histamine, or they increase the release, so they block the enzyme that breaks it down. They increase histamine through any of three different ways. You put them on an antihistamine diet, and then suddenly they start losing weight because they were just constantly eating what they thought was healthy foods. Were healthy foods. It was a slow moving full body bee sting and they were vulnerable genetically to histamine, and they were just putting on just water weight all the time, thinking that they were helping their body by eating avocados. I'm sorry to pick on avocados, but here we are. But it's this. I put histamine intolerance into the inflammatory water weight, and I just does my explanation of histamine, does that resonate with your understanding of histamine?
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen this again in my own patient population where you get the histamine under better control by whatever means, and
Correct.
people often lose weight. I can recall a patient of mine years ago where her primary driver was food sensitivities. And when she just stayed away from her food sensitivities, we didn't do anything else. She lost 55 pounds over the course of about 6 or 7 months. And it was really pretty much all water weight,
Yep.
just because she was constantly. I love that idea of like slow moving bee venom. I think,
Slow moving full body bee sting.
yeah,
Full
yeah,
body.
it's just kind of like the same thing. I think when you get this systemic inflammatory response, and particularly with mast cells that can be found throughout your body, you can get swelling anywhere.
Mhm.
And
And
if
you
you
make
aren't,
you make a good point, is that the other thing I put people on with the antihistamine diet is an elimination antihistamine diet.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That middle category, I think, is the one that I see a lot of as well, and maybe for at least me, one of the more challenging ways to deal when you've got like this hormonal, or maybe hormonal is not as difficult, but the toxic weight.
Toxic weight.
You're getting exposed to different toxins, and your body just can't clear it. I think of mold and mycotoxins probably being one of the bigger issues in that category.
Yeah, so the hormonal, I put hormonal toxic weight together simply, because having three categories total is simpler to teaching framework. Because what I saw was in the hormones in the examples I gave before, the hormones themselves became toxic in their inability to be cleared. And when whether it's mycotoxins, excessive sex hormones, or you know pollutants, metals, whatever it might be, the issue is that you've got the fat cells are the dirty closets of the body,
Mhm.
and also these fat soluble toxins are, guess where they're gonna land? In fat. And the thing about fat cells is that if the thing about toxins of this nature is that they're very dangerous to float around. That's why they're sequestered in the fat cells, and then pulling them out can cause damage as well as they just as much as they go back in. So just like in your house, you just have this dirty closet you just shove everything into. Now, to properly clean out the house, the closet, it's an operation. You got to clean out the whole house first. You got to like send the kids off to summer camp. You got to put the dog with the neighbor. You open the closet and like hold your breath, wear a mask, and you got to like pull everything out. And you turn your house into a disaster, a hazmat area. And to like sort it and pull it out and put this thing over there and deal with the dust and oh my God, I didn't realize that was burrito from 5 years ago. Whatever. It's just so much stuff to have to deal with. The body, it's the same way. To actually get your body in a state where it can handle the detox is not trivial. And if you detox too quickly, the body would rather hold on to the toxins than cause more havoc than distributing out to try to get rid of them, unless your body's ready to do it. And I'll give you a very clear example. A friend of mine in chiropractic school, he was a airline pilot for a couple of decades before he went to become a chiropractor. Now, in I think it was his seventh trimester, so he was well into school. He got violently ill. I think it might have been food poisoning or something. He got violently ill, and he rapidly lost uh some I don't remember how many pounds, but it was over 20 or 30 pounds very quickly, very, very quickly. And here's what happened. He completely lost his short-term memory. He forgot his phone number. He forgot where he lived. He couldn't go to school because what happened is all those toxins from flying in the airplanes, the exhaust from all the fuel, who knows what he was eating, you know, in those the little trays, the microwaving all the food and all the plastics, all of those toxins got dumped basically overnight, not basically immediately. Like, and he just, it just, all those toxins got recirculated, and guess what is the giant fat deposit you have in your body that's highly covered in blood vessels? Your brain. And all of those toxins got released from the other fat cells and just went straight into his brain. So that's the example I use to show, like, yeah, there's Herxheimer reactions, but then there's really bad Herxheimer's reactions where you can't remember where you live.
Right.
So that's why it can be so tough to lose the toxic weight until your body is ready. And like the image of, you know, you clean the house, you send the kids off, you send the dog away, you got a hazmat suit on, like you're ready to actually deal with this. Then you can lose, then with the proper protocols and being guided by your genetics and having the proper preparation, you can lose to safely drop the toxic weight by pulling the toxins out of the fat cells and giving the fat cells then a chance to kind of like deflate once the toxins are pulled out.
Well, I know this is a complicated issue, and of course, everyone's genetics are obviously unique to yourself and
Right.
how they translate. But you know, for anyone certainly dealing with chronic illness, I think this is an area that's worth exploring. I know one of the things that you have available for people is you have, I believe, an ebook and a mini course.
Yeah, yeah. So for people that want to know more about this particular style of genetics, there's a free ebook which goes over all of these things in much more detail and goes through the different the different drivers and different examples of all the different genes and what's possible. And also there's a mini course. When the mini course, it's for any type of learners. So there's video for the visual learners. There's an audio for the auditory learners. There's a checklist for the doers, and then there's another ebook specifically on the genetics of diet for the readers. And this is my framework of how to understand the optimal actual pyramid of health, the pyramid of food, where how to actually identify your ideal diet. By the foundation is your unique genetics. And then above it, I have to change this to metabolic, not therapeutic. Above it is your unique metabolism in the current state. So for someone, for example, like me, in this test, you can figure out, are you genetically keto, Mediterranean, high carb, or paleo? So I am second lowest carb tolerance possible. So I'm like paleo bordering on keto. But if I have my genes, I'm better suited for higher fat, but metabolically, I have a problem with my gallbladder or my pancreatic lipase or my carnitine shuttle or a problem with my mitochondria even burning fats, then I have my genetics wrapped in metabolic barbed wire, where I should eat fat for my genetics, but I can't eat fat because of my metabolism. So I'm stuck either way. On the other end of the carb spectrum, if I'm a high carb genetic person, but I have a candida infection or other infection that feeds off of high carbs, I'm screwed either way because I have high carbs for my genetics, but it feeds the infection. Or if I'm low carbs, it starves the infection, but also my genes are suffering. So for these people, this is they have to, you know, these people from a mile away because they all say the same thing. I tried every diet and it doesn't work
Right.
because no matter what, the thing to do is to do one, find out your genetics and figure out what your optimal diet is, and then they have to figure out through functional testing, like liver testing, mitochondria testing, hormone testing, gut testing, mold, whatever it is, infection testing. They find out through functional testing where is the barbed wire wrapping their genetics, and so they have to do one set of protocols first to defang the barbed wire, one set of diet, one set of protocols, and then they have to switch when that's clear over to their genetic ones. And you see this also in practice where people get on a therapeutic set of diet lifestyle protocols and they feel great for 6 months. And then things start to go bad. But they don't understand. They just got so much better. Now it's because they're out of the metabolic barbed wire, but they're now wandering away from their genetics. So they have to come back over here. So I go more and more into this framework in the ebook, but learning how to properly identify your diet at any stage of life, and with the foundation being genetics, that's what's in that ebook.
And Sam, are you still working with clients one-on-one?
I am. That's going to be shifting soon. I do have different options for people. I have a self-paced program where I have a giant back end. People get a personalized reports. They get the official reports from the genetics company, but they get my more practical, my practical reports, like here's what to do. And then there's also a back end resource portal with that goes over all the genes and gene clusters, so that people want to nerd out and go really deep into histamine or really deep into caffeine and the genetics of caffeine-induced anxiety and depression, or they want to go into if they got variations in their MAOA genes for their mood or whatever it might be. I have made probably 200 videos for people to go in and go at their own pace. And then there's an office hours version where they get access to that resource portal, but I do office hours during the week to teach a material on genetics and also do Q&A. So the other issue with other genetics companies is you don't have access to a live person who's really the principal of information. Right. And I hated that. So I made an office hours option for people. And then there's also working with me individually or working with my health coach individually. So there's different options depending on the level of attention and resources people want to devote to this.
Well, we'll post the links for our members for both options for the ebook and the mini course. And then if they want to join your group sessions, office hours, or work one-on-one. I mean, I know what I know. I know what I don't know. This is not my wheelhouse at all. So I'd rather they work with someone like you who really understands and can really fine tune. Again, I want to do something that's actionable. This is what you can actually do.
Right.
Again, giving you a bunch of genetic information that's not helpful is exactly that. We want something that you can actually manipulate in a way that moves your health forward. So
absolutely. So a true clinician is ultimately a pragmatist. What's going to work?
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate you spending time with our members today. I said we'll post the links and send it out to everybody. And hopefully you guys will get an opportunity to work with Dr. Sam, because again, he's obviously very knowledgeable in this area, and I can give you a lot of guidance on how to better improve your metabolic health, your toxic health, your genetic health, by just really understanding this roadmap of what you've been given.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with your group. I love teaching, and I wish I had my genetics test 20 years ago instead of 8 years ago. It would have really, really changed my life. And I just want to make sure people have access to the same thing.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Jim.
Thanks, Darin.